Hi, folks. Welcome to the Secular Bible Study. I'm the amateur exegete. Today's show is going to be a little different than what I normally do. Normally, I have a script in front of me that I read from, and I do that for a very good reason. I tend to ramble, so I use a script to keep me, accountable and to stay on target, to stay focused. But today we're not going to do that. Today I'm going to be a little more extemporaneous with the topic at hand. So please bear with me a little bit as I do this. It's a good exercise for me. I also would love to hear your feedback, which you can leave in the comments, or you can send me an email at amateurexegete@gmail.com. So for some context for today's show, back in August, the end of August, Reformed Christian Apologist produced a video entitled Documentary Hypothesis Debunked, Proving Mosaic Authorship. And the first 8.5 minutes or so of that video was devoted to his attempt at debunking the documentary hypothesis, which, if you're not familiar with the documentary hypothesis, it simply stated is the hypothesis that the Pentateuch is made up of four, you could call them strands, four sources that were edited, interwoven, and today comprise the Pentateuch that we have in our Bibles, in the Hebrew Bible specifically. And like many evangelicals, Reformed Christian Apologist, RC Apologist, didn't agree with it, doesn't like it, and he found problems with it. And then the second half of the video is about Mosaic authorship and why he thinks there's warrant to believe in that. So about a week and a half, 2 weeks later, I think it was, I produced my own video, which was a response to his, and pointed out some of the problem areas with his video, some technical errors, really not technical, category errors, and then, produced some evidence to show why scholars tend to think what they do on the hypothesis. And my goal was not to present a fully defended, fully fleshed out, description of the hypothesis. That was not my goal. It would take hours of video to do that, and I just don't want to do that. It took me almost half a day to upload the video that I did produce. It was crazy how long it took. And I have a pretty good upload speed, But in any event, so he watched my video, and he produced his own kind of response to it in one of his Theological Discussion videos that happened, I think it was earlier this week or last. It is the 19th as I record this. And so what we're going to do today is I'm going to play some audio from that, and then I'm going to respond. So we'll play like a minute and a half, maybe longer, depending on the section. And I'm just going to give some thoughts on what he said, and offer some insights, or offer some maybe corrections to how he's viewed something, or as I see it. So please, have a listen, and I hope you enjoy it. Here we go.
So notice right off the bat, just in case you'll need to catch that, he says that it is for him a good explanation, albeit imperfect explanation. So just keep that in mind.
So let me take a sip of this Earl Grey I have sitting next to me. Oh, that's good. What I had said in the video at the outset was that I found the documentary hypothesis to be a compelling, albeit imperfect, explanation for the origin of the Torah. And that really shouldn't be all that surprising, because we should be skeptical of anyone who says they have the answer to a problem. And the documentary hypothesis is a literary solution to a literary problem. That's what it is. I think it's Joel Baden who said that. And so, but it is still a hypothesis. It's not something we know for a fact, and I'm more than willing to admit that. But we should also make sure we have the epistemic humility to say even Mosaic authorship is not a given. That there are problems with the view of Mosaic authorship. And this is not something I went into in my video. It's not really something that I intend to go over. But and if Reformed Christian Apologist wants to have a discussion on this, I'd be more than happy to come on one of his theological discussion programs so we can kind of talk about the issue. And I'd love to hear more of his view and offer some pushback. And he can push back against me, of course. But, we need to have some humility about these topics and say, no, we don't know for certain. It's not possible. And so when I say albeit imperfect, I acknowledge there's problems with it. I just don't think there are problems that are so great that they undermine the hypothesis. But that's my take. So let's continue.
All right, and this is understandable, and I do accept this form of criticism here that is addressed. I had heard of source criticism, so not to say I wasn't familiar with the term or the concept entirely, just wasn't completely defined, and I have actually a couple of books on source criticism, just haven't had the time to look into them versus some of the other books that I've had. But I'm sure now that I actually know the name and the title of this kind of criticism, I can go into it a lot more. And in fact, I found out that New Testament criticism, textual criticism, does actually deal in some ways with source criticism of the New Testament, because if you're familiar with the Q source and the L and such that is mentioned, that's technically source criticism in the New Testament, because you're then dealing with a source. So I guess then we have this other source criticism that is mentioned, particularly in the Old Testament. So I accept correction here, but notice that at the same time, when I read textual criticism books, they always mention source theory, source criticism material. So that's kind of probably where I got mistaken in usage of the term there. So just don't hold that against me. Just saying, this I'm willing to learn. So that's why I'm glad people can make responses like this that I can be able to respond to. So let's continue onward.
So let's move backwards through this. First of all, it is a great sign to me when someone is able to accept correction, and especially when it comes to Christian apologists, because I've talked to many who, even when confronted about errors, will double down. And I mean, S.J. Thomason's a prime example of this. She does this constantly and consistently, and I don't know how anybody can follow her or take her seriously, because she lies. She just lies quite often, and when she's called out on it, she uses that block button. But RC Apologist admits that they got the information wrong, and this is not a huge issue necessarily. It is in one way, which I'll talk about in just a second, but I'm really glad that he has the humility to do that. So that is definitely a point in his favor. There's still some confusion, though. Even in New Testament criticism, when we talk about the synoptic problem, we're still talking about source criticism. We're not talking about textual criticism, because we don't have a copy of Q. It's a hypothetical document. It may or may not have existed. And if we ever found a copy of it that we could confirm was Q, we could start talking about textual criticism of the Q document. But until then, we can't. It still falls into the category of source criticism. And of course, textual criticism books may talk about Q. I don't doubt that. But it still falls into that category of source criticism. But again, if he read a textual criticism book and it mentions Q, it could have caused some confusion. I can understand that and appreciate that. But here's one of my real concerns. Since the documentary hypothesis falls into the category of source criticism, and RC Apologist didn't know what source criticism was, like in a very real way. Like he had a general gist of it, some idea, some notion, but he really didn't understand it. How are you able to attack something that you don't really know anything about? That's my concern, because if you're putting the documentary hypothesis in the wrong category, then when you attack it, you're essentially attacking a straw man. And we see this in his video when he talks about needing primary sources. If we're talking about textual criticism, that makes sense. You want primary sources. You want the text in their manuscript form. But in the documentary hypothesis, that just doesn't happen. It just does not happen. The primary sources are the texts in the Pentateuch as we have it today. That's what we have to go off of. And so that is a bit concerning to me, to be honest. It's a bit concerning, but it's not insurmountable, and it could be I'm misunderstanding him. But if you don't know what the category that the topic falls into is, how are you able to rightly criticize it? It seems to me that you've just erected a straw man and taken that down. You haven't actually attacked the argument. And that's why I said in my video that I didn't think he had debunked the hypothesis because he hadn't engaged with it. And I still hold to that position. But let's continue.
So before I let him finish there, he said he mentioned he highlights what Friedman's view is. So he says, in 10th to 8th century BCE, there's the formation of the J in Judah and then the E in Israel's source. So what primary sources from these, whether they be from historical documents or from original manuscript documents, concerning any of the primary sources versus secondary sources, such as Friedman's would be considered a secondary source, leads us to make this conclusion other than simply making speculations on, we're kind of going to rewind a bit, which would take away what was said earlier, but we're going to try to get back on track. Yahweh uses the J source uses the Yahweh, and presented in anthropomorphic terms. The E source, says that it uses Elohim. Deity is remote. Emphasis on prophets. If we're focusing on this for distinction, why that? Why not that any time that there's an anthropomorphic reference, why not describe that to the Elohist source? Why not describe that to the priestly source? So how do you come to these conclusions of ascribing certain attributes besides, the D is the Deuteronomist source, so meaning that whatever's in Deuteronomy is, that's a particular source, and saying that it's likely originated in the northern kingdom of Israel I would be interested in seeing the primary sources or anything that can help us understand how that would come to the conclusion.
So I'm not really interested in defending Friedman's dating of the documents. I think if RC Apologist really wants to dig into that, he needs to pick up his Who Wrote the Bible, which Friedman goes into that topic. You could even get his book, The Bible with Sources Revealed, where he briefly goes over that. I would recommend getting both of them, but I would actually start with Who Wrote the Bible. That's where I would start. Because he kind of explains the dating for those books, and he does it based on historical inferences, what we can tell from history, and then textual inferences, things that are found in the biblical texts themselves that kind of hint at these things, and gives us some kind of timeline. So I'm not going to defend Friedman. I'll let RC Apologist, look into that. He talked about. I produced a chart in the video that lays out the four sources and some of the basic characteristics. And I got that chart, I adapted it from the text of Michael Coogan's Introduction to the Old Testament textbook, which is a really great textbook. I recommend you get it. I think they're in the 4th edition, so the edition I have is the 3rd. You might be able to find it cheaper than the current edition, so I would grab it up. Usually when they change textbook editions, there's not major changes, so it doesn't really, there's no warrant to buy a new one. And so I would, if you can pick up the 3rd edition, please do. You'll love it. I'm almost done reading it. It's taken me a while, but I've kind of worked slowly through it to kind of glean as much as I can. In any event, so I adapted that chart that listed the 4 sources and some of the characteristics from Coogan's book. So RC Apologist asked the question, why not attribute, passages with Yahweh to the Elohist source or to the priestly source? Well, We can. The argument isn't that every time Yahweh appears, that it's automatically in the Yahweh source. That's not the argument. Okay, that's not what we're saying. There's more to it than that. What we look for are certain characteristics. Is there an internal consistency within these strands that we seem to find? If we find these consistencies, we have warrant to think, oh, well, maybe this was a separate source, and it was interwoven with another source in the text. So a prime example of this is found in the very beginning of the Bible, in the book of Genesis. And so RC Apologist is probably very familiar with this, so I don't want to go over it in detail. But when you compare the Genesis 1 account of creation, it starts with the temporal clause in the beginning when God created the heavens and the earth. The term there for God is Elohim. He's not. That's just a generic name. There's not a definite name given to this God. We know it's the Jewish God, and we can even say it's Yahweh in some sense. But that's not what the author is doing. He's speaking in very general terms there of the name of God. But there are key differences between the first chapter of Genesis and the second. So in the first story, for example, the God is Elohim. In the second, which starts at Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, the second half of the verse, so 2:4b. And remember that chapter and verse markings were not original to the Old Testament or the New Testament. Those weren't part of it. In fact, famously, when you read New Testament manuscripts, there was no division between the words. In an uncial or even a minuscule, the words are all stuck together. So you have to be very careful as to how you read it in Greek. But either way, so in Genesis chapter 1, it's Elohim. In Genesis chapter 2, 4b and following, it's Yahweh Elohim. So he has a specific name. In chapter 1, the earth is covered in water. This is the beginning stages of God's work. That the world is covered in water, and he has to separate out the waters, and it's dark. But in Genesis 2, it's dry. There's no rain, but there's dry land. And a water comes up just to water the ground, but that's it. In the first creation story in chapter 1, for example, the vegetation comes up on the third day. So you're looking at verses 11 through 13. But in Genesis 2, in that story, there's no vegetation, because there's no rain, number one, and number two, there's no one to till the ground. There's no human. Okay? So there's a problem. In Genesis chapter 1, you see where the animals they come forth from the earth on the fifth and sixth day before the creation of humanity. But in Genesis chapter 2, they come after the creation of humanity, specifically the creation of man, the male character in the story. Also, in Genesis 1, God says things and they happen. He says, let there be, and there's this. Let the earth do this, and there's this, he speaks and it happens. But in Genesis 2, he's more hands-on. Verse 7 of chapter 2, then the Lord God formed man. And that idea here is almost like a potter in clay. He forms man from the dust of the ground. He breathes into his nostrils. Like this deity has a mouth and a nose, and he can breathe into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. And then he places the man in the garden. It's only after the man that it says the Lord plants the garden and the vegetation starts to come out. There's trees. This is not what happens in chapter 1. And then, of course, God determines it's not good that man should be alone. And so what does he do? He forms from the earth all these animals and brings them to Adam, to man, to see what he would name them. And then when he doesn't find a helpmeet, he puts Adam to sleep, and he takes a rib out, and he closes it up. More hands-on activity. This is the vision of a different author of what the deity is doing. It's the same deity, but these are different stories about the origin of creation, the origin of all things. And, apologists have many attempts to put these two together, and they're just, they're always very contrived, and they require some serious hermeneutical gymnastics. So, if we're trying to just read the text, we come up with these obvious contradictions, these obvious problems that have to be accounted for in some way. And the documentary hypothesis is, maybe this is a case of two different traditions, two different strands, two different sources. The first source telling the story of this more remote deity, this deity who's more high and lifted up, who's who orders the creation. Whereas in chapter 2, it's still a powerful deity. It's no less powerful than Elohim in chapter 1. It's the same. But there instead the deity is more hands-on. He's more active. He forms. He molds. It's just a different view. And then we can see similar continuity in other stories in the Old Testament. In the story of the flood, we see what seems to be two different strands woven together. One from a source that has Elohim, who's high and lifted up, and the other who has this Yahweh, who shuts the door of the ark, who smells Noah's sacrifice. These are differences, and this can be repeated throughout, and we see different stories and different versions. And we see different concerns, and this is one of the things that Friedman brings out, is these different authors appear to have different concerns. And it's not surprising. If anyone who's read the book of Deuteronomy knows, hey, listen, this is a different book than the first four. It really is. It even tells you it is from the very first first chapter. When you look at chapter 1, verse 1, it says, "These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan." Well, that tells you that whoever wrote this is on the other side of that Jordan from Moses. If he said these words beyond it, then whoever put these down is on the other side. They're in Israel. Moses was not. And it's just a different book. It's just a different book than the rest. It has a different feeling. It has different versions of laws. It even has different laws. It's just a different kind of book. So that doesn't give an exhaustive answer, an exhaustive reply. But the point is, scholars just don't arbitrarily put certain texts into certain categories of sources. It takes more than just saying, oh, well, this word appears here, therefore it's this. No, it involves more than that. Because, and you'll see this in Friedman. He'll say, listen, this is a consistent usage, but not universal. This term is used consistently in P, but not universally. It's all about context and what we can tell by the surrounding context, whether this is a P source or a J source or an E source or a D source. That's what really determines it. And that's why I really think RC Apologist should read Richard Elliott Friedman's book and try to appreciate the work of scholars working on that specific topic. So, let's just stop with that. But let's move on to what he says next.
Well, the issue concerning the reason why I didn't mention them by name is because, again, there were definitely several that I had to look into concerning that. The Friedman, the one you mentioned, is one that I had heard about, especially by reading upon Heiser, who mentions that, with Friedman's, either it was Friedman or Kugel, I forget which one that he mentioned, but I'm pretty sure it was Friedman, mentions the documentary hypothesis and why Heiser finds that while Heiser may have a different view towards than I do on the issue, he definitely disagrees and thinks there's flaws and problems with Friedman's understanding and take on the hypothesis. But another one that was used is an old book that I got from an associate, and I'm trying to find where it is, because it is definitely something to keep in mind. I guess 1984 is when it was published. I think it was no, that wasn't it. It was a book called Introduction to the Old Testament, and it had like a bull on it. And so it was something that was definitely interesting. And it definitely was a liberal scholarship book. Like I said, I'm gonna have to try to do my best to find this particular work, because it was it was one of the introduction to the Old Testament books that you used in seminary back in the day, and this was used in the 80s. So with that was one of them. I didn't bring that particular book with me, but I guarantee and rest assured I do indeed have that book. Then there was, in trying to examine this particular issue, I've been looking into some of the other books that have been well recommended in terms of scholarship, and that was Dictionary of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, which is a book that is, Dictionary of the Old Testament Pentateuch, also known as a compendium of contemporary biblical scholarship, with the general editors T. Desmond Alexander and David Day Baker. I forget who the scholar was that contributed to the specific dictionary entry on Moses and Mosaic authorship and such. But concerning that, it kind of read liberal in the theory, since it was kind of leaning toward the idea of, it's possible Moses didn't create these sources, or author this book, but instead it's from these sources and such. So I mean, you have other people that are in likewise holding to this particular view. So those are just a few bits of the scholars, if you're wanting specific names of them. So I mean, it wasn't intentional. I was just trying to not make the video longer than it already was. That was the whole point.
So, a couple things here. I do have some concerns still about his claim that he's read through the relevant, quote, liberal, unquote, sources. So he says he heard about Friedman. I think he heard about it in a Michael Heiser book, or, I'm not very familiar with Heiser. It's not a scholar I've really read. But just merely hearing about it, especially from a source that doesn't agree with it, you're getting a view that is somewhat colored by the person writing. So merely hearing about an author isn't the same thing as reading. Second, the book he's talking about that is from 1984 with the bull on the cover. Let me pull it up real quick. I think this is it. It's the only book I could find that resembles what he's talking about. Is Reading the Old Testament in Introduction. It's by Lawrence Boat, or Boat, B-O-A-D-T, who I think is a Roman Catholic scholar. But I'm not entirely sure he agrees with source criticism of the Old Testament in the form of the documentary hypothesis. So I'm not sure. He says in the book, let's see if I can find it. He says, instead of Wellhausen's doubt that anything could be attributed to Moses, form criticism affirms that while the Pentateuch was not actually written down by Moses, many of its traditions, legal practices, and covenant forms may actually date back to the time of Moses, and their central importance for Israel may have even originated with him, or at least with the community of the Exodus and conquest. So, form criticism is different than source criticism. Okay, so we're talking about form criticism is really about genre, and he looks at myths or kind. In New Testament source criticism, we look at parables, we look at introductory statements, we look at summary statements, we look at healing stories, things like that. And it's similar in Old Testament studies as well. So form criticism is a different kind of criticism. And so I'm not sure about that. He may affirm it. I'm not really familiar with that work. I'm actually looking at it on Amazon right now because I don't have access to the book, but it shows you some sections. So I'm reading some of it, on the documentary hypothesis. As for the book, which is edited by T. Desmond Alexander, which is the Dictionary of the Pentateuch, the article on the authorship of the Pentateuch is by T. Desmond Alexander. And as far as I know, T. Desmond Alexander does not affirm the documentary hypothesis. He discusses it at length. In his book, From Paradise to the Promised Land, it comes up. I think the first major section is on it. So I'm not sure. Again, I'm not totally sure if he's really, really read anyone who has fully promoted the documentary hypothesis. So, which is why I recommend he read Friedman, he read Baden, he read Coogan, he read even Bernard Anderson's Introduction to the Old Testament. Norman Gottwald, to a certain degree, his is more of a socio-historical interpretation. He's I think he's a Marxist interpreter. He's got some very valuable information in his book, but some of his views are not always are less than orthodox. Is one way to put it, but either way, I'm still very skeptical about what RC Apologist has actually read. So this kind of concerns me a little bit, and I could be wrong. And so I, like the whole thing about Lawrence Boat's reading the Old Testament, my familiarity with it is just very passive, and so I'm not, I'm looking at it on Amazon and trying to discern anything, and that's always hard to do when you don't have the book in front of you. So if RC Apologist could give me a full quotation, that shows that this is a scholar who promotes the hypothesis, that would be phenomenal. But from looking at the Amazon text, it does not look like that is the case. So at any event, let's move on.
Yeah, the declining of the consistency of the documentary hypothesis, meaning that at some point, like I said, at its basic level, without any opponents challenging the theory, challenging the hypothesis, it sounds decent and consistent enough in its approach. But by the time we see someone in the scholarly field get in and actually challenge it, then that's where we start seeing the holes, the gaps, the inconsistency of the theory that is the documentary hypothesis.
So obviously, if you only read one side, that side's going to be persuasive. I think there's a proverb that says, and it's in the book of Proverbs, it says, the gist of it is, everyone believes one side of the story until the other side comes along. So yeah, I agree with that. If you only read about the documentary hypothesis, more than likely you're going to be convinced that it's true. But, growing up, all I ever heard about was Mosaic authorship. And any reference to, and it was never called the documentary hypothesis in so many of the books I read, it was the JEDP theory. And it was always sneered at and always made fun of. And Wellhausen was always mocked. And, so I was born and bred in a world where if you denied Mosaic authorship, you were denying God. And I believe that for the longest time, even during when I left my fundamentalist days as a King James onlyist to my more evangelical Reformed Calvinistic days, I accepted Mosaic authorship. And it wasn't until, I became an atheist and really got more into Old Testament studies than I was before, that the documentary hypothesis made the most sense. And but like I've said before, it's not perfect. There are issues with it. So, but in any event, yeah, of course, if there's no challenge to it, it always looks good. And whenever there's a challenge that comes up, it has to be dealt with. The same is true for Mosaic authorship as well. So let's have some balance there. Let's move on.
The Jews were actually not henotheistic, and that cannot be demonstrated. In fact, we actually had a discussion over that with me in Inspiring Philosophy, where though he would say and use the term henotheist, that the early Jews were henotheists originally, he would cite Michael Heiser to support that based on the usage of the council of the gods, the divine council and all that. But in reality, that's not the case. With concerning, that it's not, henotheism. In fact, even Heiser notes that wasn't henotheism. People tried using his work to promote that, but he said that would be them being disingenuous and dishonest in applying that work. And that's why even some YouTuber who's part of the Arian Church, the Arian Orthodox Church is what he calls it, criticized Heiser for, because people used Heiser to support that, and they're saying that, they're disingenuous. And that's when they, start hating Heiser as soon as that gets mentioned. So no, there was no henotheism, and the people that would think that, especially in application with the term of Elohim, is being very gross in its application of the term Elohim that is used, and the history of the ancient Jewish people.
So this isn't a point that needs to be dwelt on very much, but the fact of the matter is, and this is not debatable, when you look at ancient Israelite religion, it appears to be very henotheistic. That they believed other deities existed, they were not as great as Yahweh, but that they were real. And this is reflected in the biblical writings. It's just plain as day. And when you look at various archaeological discoveries that they've made over in Israel, you see where deities other than Yahweh are accepted as being in existence, even worshipped. Which is no longer henotheism, of course. It's now polytheism. But the history of ancient Israelite religion is not cut and dry, like many evangelicals want to suppose it is. It's very messy. It's very messy, and the writers of the biblical texts for a long time took for granted the existence of other deities. In the book of Exodus, for example, when Yahweh executes judgment on Egypt through the plagues, he says he's executing judgment on all the gods of Egypt. Now, you don't execute judgment on beings that do not exist. So from the worldview of the author alone, other gods were in existence. But Yahweh was supreme over all of them. There was no match. He could do what he wanted. But there was a recent article put out by by Haaretz, which is an Israeli newspaper. I had a couple friends on Twitter post to it, talking about the Misha stele. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it is a stone tablet that has on it the description of a victory over Israel, over the house of Omri. And it's King Mesha, who takes back some of the cities, the territory of Moab, because Chemosh, his deity, had at one time been angry with the Moabites and made it so Israel could take them back. But then he showed favor on them again, and they took all the vessels of Yahweh and brought them before Chemosh. And it's not a very flattering view of Yahweh. And it's an interesting little piece of archaeology. But even the Moabites appeared to think, yeah, well, Yahweh exists, but Chemosh is greater. As was often the case, these are local tribal deities, different deities for different areas. And, the deity of one area was the supreme deity. And if you wanted to challenge a people group in battle, you were essentially asking your god to challenge the other god to duel. And that's why often Yahweh is described as a warrior. He's a warrior god. He takes on other deities. He takes on these armies. And he's supreme in Israel. But yeah, to say that they were always monotheistic is just, I'm sorry, it's just not tenable. Just not tenable at all.
Now, we actually already addressed this. In fact, this was also went over in the previous theological discussion with a White Engine. So if you want to check that out, me and HistoryNet doing the discussion there, feel free to go and do so.
So what I had brought up was in the book of Exodus, chapter 6, Yahweh tells Moses that he says, I am Yahweh. To Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, I was not known as Yahweh. I was known as El Shaddai, or God Almighty. And he says, now I am going to be known by Yahweh. But when you look at the Old Testament text, and if you look at the Old Testament, so if you look at the book of Genesis, and you look at Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you see repeatedly God is referred to as El Shaddai. So that fits the story. But then you also see in other passages where God is not referred to as simply El Shaddai. He is actually called Yahweh. And I listed a few passages that illustrate that point. Specifically dealing with Abraham, because he's the ultimate progenitor. But it shows clearly that he was known as Yahweh in some texts. So either you have a contradiction, or there's something else going on. And that something else is probably that one source saw Yahweh as always being known by his name Yahweh, and another source says no. The tradition is Moses was made known the name Yahweh. No one else was. It was only Moses. It just kind of elevates Moses somewhat. He's given this special, unique revelation. Now, one of the standard apologetic answers is, well, what they mean there is he wasn't fully known as Yahweh. It wasn't a full revelation. I had someone describe it like, my name is Ben, and what if I said, you can call me BJ, my initials, but by my name Benjamin, I was not known before, but I am now. Yeah, that was kind of confusing. So let's phrase it differently. So let's say people I knew a long time ago, I said they knew me as BJ. They didn't know my name was Benjamin. They just knew BJ. But to you, I'm going to say my name is Benjamin, so you know my full name. Well, huh? Oh, how does that help? That doesn't help at all. The fact of the matter is, Moses is saying that, or the Exodus passage is saying, Yahweh was not known as Yahweh to the patriarchs. He was only known as Yahweh to Moses. Before that, he was El Shaddai. And the Old Testament, in some passages, bears that out. And in others, it doesn't. In others, it contradicts it. In others, Abraham knows him as Yahweh. So what do we do with that? Do we mask, do we kind of cover it up with this apologetic, these gymnastics, these contrived explanations, or do we say, maybe there's something else going on? Maybe there's different traditions that viewed the patriarchal history up until the revelation to Moses. And that's, what I think is, I think that's much more in line with the texts. I don't think we need to perform these apologetic gymnastics to account for it. It just seems cheap to me. That's just what it feels like. It's just cheap. And I used to teach it. I used to say the same thing, to gloss it over. And the more I thought about it, the more I don't like this. I do not like this explanation. There's got to be something more. And the documentary hypothesis really helped explain it to me. It removes, in some sense, the contradiction. So let's move on.
Now, here's the thing. Going back. So, gathered to his people. Abraham was gathered to his people and all that. Okay, why does gathered to his people, how does that constitute as being part of the priestly source? I mean, when someone look at that, like, gathered to his people, that sounds like something Moses wouldn't write. So does that mean it's part of a different source? Okay, which source? Let's put it in the priestly source. I'm trying to understand. Shall be gathered to. Where do we see that means it belongs to a specific source that is outside Mosaic authorship? I mean, it just small things like that. It's like taking apart this David De Silva book and be like, well, he claims to have written the book, but there's certain words and phrases that we can find in this particular book that we can say maybe it was part of a different source. In fact, there was actually a book that was done by a lawyer that examined the styles of these two authors that co-authored a book together, and when examining the different chapters, using the method of these two critical people, they would say, well, by their own standard, their book was written by multiple different people and not by themselves because of certain stylistic differences and certain phrases that were used versus others. I mean, it's just things like that make no sense to me. And then, as he explains later on, this is Mount Sinai versus Horeb and the Mountain of God, saying that Horeb and the Mountain of God is part of the E source, while Mount Sinai is part of the J source. Again, how do you distinguish and make that, or say that that's because it's part of a different source?
So this, again, is something that concerns me. Because if RC Apologist had read a book, if he had read a scholar who was supporting the position and was defending it, you would see the logic of why they place certain texts in certain categories. It's not just you see a phrase and therefore it goes there. It's that these are consistent terms that are used, and they appear in certain contexts that also fit other criteria. And so this is why I'm very skeptical of the claim that he's made that he's read these texts that he says he has. Liberal, quote, liberal sources. I don't know. I have my doubts. Let's move on.
Well, again, like I said, there's of course also another liberal scholar that's been pointed out. And again, I even utilized the liberal scholar concerning this issue. But while there's points that she brought out, I also want to point out that concerning it, I was just simply pointing out what she had said that should cause us not to simply dismiss it entirely. Again, just because some scholar says something doesn't mean that that person's right. So I wasn't saying because of the fact that, an issue gets more complicated, that means we should, completely forsake it. Because as is pointed out, and this is actually, as mentioned in the slide here, in the next pages, where she's talking about this stuff, about a newer documentary hypothesis, and it shouldn't be discarded. But I still believe we should still examine these things. Just that the newer documentary hypothesis issues didn't necessarily get dealt with in too much detail. The main issue is going over the documentary hypothesis as has been used by most of the modern people today, some of which still cling to the traditional format, at least the people that I have dealt with. So
something needs to be said here about the article that he read by David Stern. One thing that's quite obvious, and it's obvious because RC Apologist, when he quotes Pauline Viviano, he's not quoting directly Pauline Viviano. He's quoting Stern, quoting Pauline Viviano. And the way we know this is when you read Stern's article and you read the words where he says, let's see if I can pull up the article itself. Let's see, he says, he's quoting from Viviano. He says this, after summarizing the different opinions, Pauline Viviano says, and then he quotes part of it, and then there's a sentence right here, where Viviano says, even for those able to avoid skepticism and confusion in the face of the ever-increasing number of sources, the only logical conclusion seems to be to move away from, and then he has in brackets, Wellhausen's, and that's to close the brackets, documentary hypothesis toward a position closer to the fragmentary hypothesis. This is what's interesting about that, is Stern has taken the word newer from the original that Viviano had and inserted Wellhausen. So that now the quote seems like Viviano is attacking the documentary hypothesis in this sentence, when really she was attacking the newer documentary hypothesis. Okay, now that might not be important to you, but it's important to me because it's kind of like quote mining. I mean, in fact, that's exactly what it is because he hasn't had Viviano right in front of him to see it, he didn't know there was more to it. And then my slide that I produced showing Viviano's statement that we shouldn't just discard it, well, either that or source criticism, it gives this nuance to what she's saying. It gives you more color to what's being said there. And that's why it's always dangerous to quote mine. If you can, get the source and try to see if you can find out what the context is. Because, sometimes authors will take a text and just run with it. Text without a context is a pretext for a proof text. As I think it's D.A. Carson who said that in his book, Exegetical Fallacies. But in any event, this is another concerning point, that there's this kind of quote mining going on. It starts with Stern, but once you just accept Stern and you quote somebody he's quoting, he's clearly altered the quote. I mean, he has in brackets, which is a standard way to show that you've altered a quotation. It's not parentheses; it's in brackets. So we just want to be careful not to misrepresent what a scholar's saying, and to kind of get the full picture of whatever they're saying, and especially since Viviano makes it clear that we should not discard, nor should we wholeheartedly accept the newer documentary hypothesis. She's not directly. This is not about the Wellhausen's documentary hypothesis per se, but either way. Let's move on.
Okay, again, I'm not trying to simply invalidate. Now, when I say debunking the documentary hypothesis, what I'm trying to do with the whole thing is that this hypothesis has some flaws, some things that are indeed false, and one of which is simply just ascribing something just because, it seems like it fits a different pattern or category, when nor does it seem to indicate that that's the case. If that's the case, we can do that with any book we have today and try to ascribe a certain source and apply source criticism to our modern books and literature today. So, I don't know. There's just a problem with that.
So this may be splitting hairs, but when I see the word debunked, I get the impression that you are taking the argument down. You're taking something down. So that's why I use the word invalidate. Invalidate just means to make it not valid. That is to say that you're showing it why it's not true. So it's not merely pointing out the flaws. If that's what you were doing, if that's what RC Apologist was doing, then, you wouldn't have just because an argument has flaws doesn't mean necessarily that it's incorrect. I think that's called the fallacy. If that was the case, there's numerous flaws with Mosaic authorship that we could point out, and does the fact that there are flaws mean Mosaic authorship is invalid? Well, no. You have to build a stronger case than that. You have to show why the flaws are of such a nature that they undermine the general gist of whatever argument's being made. It's not, and again, that may be just splitting hairs. I'm not sure. It's not a huge point. It's not a very important point. But, let's move on.
So while I haven't done it in the video, I will let you know now that I have looked into it, and I didn't cite them. But there are people that I have looked into that do affirm this position. And I have the sources back at my house as well as on my iPhone and computer. So I didn't just blindly go into it. I even had to listen to Floyd FP on YouTube, who was given a decent talk about this whole thing. So, all right.
So in context there, I had reiterated that I doubted whether he had used any, quote, liberal sources. And, I still have my doubts. In the future, RC Apologist may want to include maybe a reference page at the end, kind of like what I did in my video, just so you know that there are what sources you use for your discussion. But one of my main criticism is if you're gonna take down an argument, you probably want to know the argument pretty well. And when you present the argument, it's best to do it in terms of people of the people that are actually espouse, that hold the view. Like, it would be like me quoting an Arminian, and his take on Calvinism. Now, wouldn't you say, well, hold on, why not quote an actual Calvinist who believes Calvinism and get his view on the topic rather than quote someone who doesn't? Or alternatively, it would be like, someone who believes in young earth creationism, but only quoting Richard Dawkins and getting his view on young earth creationism. Well, why not quote a young earth creationist and get their view and then take it down? If you're going to present an argument, I recommend doing it in the voice of one who accepts the argument as true, not in the voice of one who rejects it. Or at most a neutral party, one who says it's neither true nor false, we just don't know. That's just my take, and I could be wrong on that. There's probably examples where you could show me I would be wrong on that take. So I think if RC Apologist was really serious there about presenting the documentary hypothesis and taking it down, then he would have quoted from actual scholars who support it. Not merely scholars who reject it. Because every quotation he provided was somebody who was lamenting the documentary hypothesis' existence. Pauline Viviano, Walter Kaiser, I think, was one of them. John C. Collins, I think, was another. Oh, no, John Kirid, not John C. Collins. John Kirid was another. So I just, and it could be, sometimes when we talk about things, we assume the audience has knowledge that we have. So maybe it's that RC Apologist already had this in his head, already had this knowledge, and just assumed his audience did, and just assumed that anyone watching would. So it was, he took it for granted, and I can understand that, and that's a possibility. But my feeling is that that's just not the case. But again, I could be wrong. But let's stop here for just a second.
All right. So that was the video. That was the Richard Elliott Friedman, The Bible with Sources Revealed. And then, of course, who wrote the Bible. I think that one, I believe, is what I saw at Books A Million when I had heard of it. All right. So, concerning that particular video that was just played, I've given my response and my thought to it. Unless he wants to send me some books that deals with it in more detail, then he knows how to contact me, and we'll get that out of the way. But yeah, mostly I would just say that based on what was said, still there was no proving of a good case for the documentary hypothesis. it still was, these statements, and because these certain statements say something, versus, for example, saying a mountain of Sinai, and then and just saying mountain, then that means it's a different source. I mean, to me, that just does not. I don't see how that makes any sense to do that. So, I mean, again, I would be also waiting to see if what you're making of the case for Mosaic authorship, when that video will be released by you. So, who knows? We'll probably get to that one day. But anyways, that has been all that we have on the show today.
So, RC Apologist asked for books to kind of look into that deal with these issues. The reference page I gave in that video, I listed a number of books. I would recommend reading those. The introductions to the Old Testament, usually the sections on the authorship, the composition of the Torah are shorter, and so the benefit of those books is you're not getting a book just for that one topic, you're getting it for a wide variety, so I'd recommend those. But again, Friedman's books on the topic are really fantastic. I'm also reading right now Stephen Demetti's Genesis 1 and the Creationism Debate, and it's subtitled Being Honest, the Text, Its Author, and His Beliefs, and I'm probably about maybe a third of the way through. And I just got done reading his section on the Genesis 1 account, and it's fascinating, and now we're getting out of the Genesis 2 account and the differences between the two, and he's going to show his case as to why they are from different authors. So, Stephen Demetti is I really like his stuff, and his website, contradictionsinthebible.com, is very enlightening, just really good. He shows the different stories, the different claims made in the Torah and how they contradict other ones, and then he explains what is probably going on based on what the documentary hypothesis says. So it's really interesting to see that at work. I was also not trying to make a fully fleshed out defense of the documentary hypothesis. That wasn't my goal. My goal was simply to respond to the video that RC Apologist had made. So I have no plans to do a fully fleshed out video on the documentary hypothesis. Maybe in the future, but I doubt it. My focus really is on the New Testament, and namely the Gospel of Mark. If you read my blog, I do musings on Mark on Wednesdays. So that's really kind of where my focus is. This was kind of an interesting detour in what I normally do. And finally, as I believe I said before, I don't have any plans to do a video on Mosaic authorship. It would be an interesting topic to explore, but it's just not something I have planned right now. But as I think I said before, if RC Apologist would like to have a discussion in one of his theological discussions, I would be more than happy to do that with him. We can kind of talk about what his views are specifically and why he thinks they are, what they are, like what texts he bases it on, what the limits of that view are. He can push back against my own, and I'd love to, ask him questions about his view and have that dialogue. But in any event, this has not been a thorough response to his response. And it wasn't my intention. It was just kind of do a stream of consciousness kind of discussion based on what he said in his video. But I hope it's been of some benefit to you. This has been kind of a lengthy one, and I apologize for that. But I do hope it's been beneficial, been helpful. Hopefully RC Apologist has time to listen to this. Because it is kind of long, he might not, so I don't blame him for that. But again, I do appreciate everyone who listens, who supports the blog, who's watched previous videos, who interacts with me on Twitter. I appreciate all of you, atheists, Christians alike, and I guess I'll throw in you agnostics. But this has been the Secular Bible Study, kind of a different episode. I'm the Amateur Exegete, signing off.